The chandeliers glittered above me like frozen rain, but all I noticed was the way my mother's hand trembled as she tried to balance her champagne glass. My father stood taller than I remembered, straining to look respectable in a suit he had borrowed. They had walked into this gala with one purpose: to catch the attention of the CEO they had idolized for years, the man whose framed photograph once hung in my father's study as proof of what success looked like. When he turned toward them, they smiled, as if heaven itself had opened. Then he spoke, his voice smooth, his words deliberate. "I'd like you to meet my boss." He gestured toward me. For a moment, the entire ballroom seemed to stop breathing. My parents' eyes flicked to me, then back to him, searching for a mistake, a correction. But none came. He clasped my shoulder with quiet respect. Their silence cracked like porcelain. I stood steady, though. Inside, a storm of memory tore at me: the kitchen floor I had scrubbed on my knees, the plates I had washed, while my brother played video games, the voice of my father telling neighbors, "She's like our maid." And yet here, under the glittering lights, the roles had reversed. I felt the weight of every unnoticed effort lifting, replaced by a calm I could not name. I asked myself, not aloud, but deep within, when did I stop being their servant and become someone they could no longer command? When I think back to my childhood, the memories that rise first aren't of birthday parties or bedtime stories. They are of chores. I remember being 9 years old, barely tall enough to reach the sink, standing on a wobbly stool so I could wash dishes after dinner. My brother, only a year older, was already excused from helping because my parents said he needs to focus on his studies. I wanted to believe that if I scrubbed the plates until they shone, if I folded the laundry with perfect corners, maybe they would look at me with the same softness they gave him. But instead, their praise was saved entirely for him, while my efforts blended into the wallpaper of the house. One birthday stands out in sharp relief. It was my brother's 10th. There was a cake, tall and frosted, with his name written in bright blue letters. Streamers hung from the ceiling. Cousins crowded the living room, and my parents were glowing with pride. I was told to pass around plates to refill the punch bowl, to clean up wrappers tossed on the floor. My name was nowhere on the cake, not even squeezed into the corner. That night, when the last balloon sagged and the guests were gone, I washed the sticky plates alone, the sound of soap bubbles popping louder than the silence in my chest. The next morning, I went to school wearing a sweater my mother had bought at a yard sale. It smelled faintly of someone else's home, and the sleeves were too short. I noticed the difference between me and the other girls, the way their mothers braided their hair, the way they carried shiny new backpacks. Mine was patched twice with thread that didn't match, and when I asked for a new one, my father shook his head. We don't waste money on things that aren't necessary. Yet the following week, my brother came home with new sneakers that cost more than all my school supplies combined. Small acts piled up, years of them, until it became routine. At 12, I was sent to the grocery store with a list, and exact change warned not to come back with even a penny unaccounted for. At 14, I was cooking full dinners, roasts, casseroles, and pies for holiday gatherings, while my mother boasted to relatives that my brother was so smart, destined for something big. I was the invisible hand that made their meals appear, the shadow that kept the house running. Sometimes, when I finished my chores late at night, I would sneak a flashlight under my blanket and read library books until my eyes blurred. Stories of women who became doctors, lawyers, leaders. I clung to those pages like oxygen because they hinted at a world outside the chipped linoleum and endless laundry. Still, every time I closed the book and turned off the light, the same question lingered inside me, unanswered. Why did love feel like a prize I could never win? By the time I turned 16, I had learned how to fold my dreams small enough to hide inside the drawer of my nightstand. I wanted to study art, to sketch and paint, to let my hands make something other than spotless countertops. But when I brought home brochures from the state university, my father shook his head before I could finish explaining. "College is wasted on you," he said flatly. "Your brother will need support with his sports expenses. Be useful." He picked up the pamphlet and tore it straight down the middle, the sound sharper than any slap. I watched the pieces drift to the floor, pale scraps of paper against the dull carpet, and something inside me crumpled. I didn't cry in front of him. I picked up the torn halves and tucked them under my mattress, as if keeping the fragments could somehow preserve the possibility. My brother's needs came first in everything. I worked part-time at a diner after school, sliding plates of burgers and fries across chipped counters, and the money I earned went toward his gear, new gloves, cleats, tournament fees. He strutted through the house with his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, bragging about road games while I trudged in with aching feet and grease in my hair. One night he brought his friends over. My mother called me into the living room with a sharp tone, pressed a tray of chips and sodas into my hands, and said, "Serve them." The boys laughed when I bent down to place the snacks on the table, one of them whispering, "She's like the Maid." My cheeks burned, but I kept my eyes down. The humiliation lodged in me like a thorn I couldn't pull out. Even small victories were stolen. I had stayed up all night finishing a sketch for an art contest at school. When the teacher praised my work, handing me a certificate, I rushed home to show my mother. She glanced at it once, set it aside, and said, "Go peel the potatoes." Hours later, I found the certificate crumpled near the trash. My brother, meanwhile, brought home a participation ribbon, and they cheered as if he had won the Olympics. I lay awake that night, staring at the faint glow of the streetlight through my curtains. My fingers traced the torn university brochure under the mattress, and I asked myself a question I didn't dare voice aloud. Was I born only to serve, or was I allowed to live? The silence of the house answered for me. Yet even in that silence, I felt the ache of wanting more, like a pulse under my skin that refused to die down. At 18, the first real door opened in front of me, though my parents did everything they could to slam it shut. I had been accepted into a state university, a small victory I had clawed out of late nights, hidden study sessions, and the stubborn belief that there had to be something beyond scrubbing floors. I still remember the moment the letter arrived. My hands shook as I opened it on the front porch, the afternoon sun falling across the words, "Congratulations." I pressed the paper to my chest, thinking maybe my parents would finally see me. Instead, my mother laughed when I showed her. "You think you're going to college with what money? Don't be ridiculous." My father's eyes didn't soften either. "She'll be back in a month, broke and begging. Some people just aren't made for more." Their dismissal landed like a stone in my stomach, heavy and cold. My brother smirked from the doorway, already planning a summer trip my parents had paid for. He didn't even need to ask for their support. It was always there, like a faucet turned on just for him. That night, I stared at the acceptance letter on my bed. My suitcase sat in the corner, half-packed, as though waiting for permission. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator. I whispered to myself, "I will go even if it kills me." And I did. I worked 3 jobs that summer: mornings at the diner, afternoons shelving books at the library, evenings babysitting for families who treated me more kindly in a week than my own parents had in years. Every paycheck was split between tuition and the cheapest room I could find near campus. I carried grocery bags in the rain, my shoes soaked through, while classmates zipped by in cars their parents had bought them. My clothes smelled of fry grease and cheap detergent, but I wore them with a strange sort of pride. I was doing this on my own. That money went into a savings account I opened secretly. Every dollar felt like a secret seed planted in soil. No one else could see, a promise that one day I might have a life of my own. Still, my parents didn't let me go completely. They demanded I return home every weekend. "The house won't clean itself," my mother said. "Family obligations don't end just because you're off playing student." So I rode the bus back, spent 2 days cooking and scrubbing, then dragged myself back to campus. Sunday night, my fingers raw from bleach, and my mind drained before the week even began. I told myself it was temporary, that one day I would leave for good. The breaking point came during my second year. I overheard my parents speaking to neighbors at a barbecue. They were bragging about my brother again, telling everyone how brilliant he was, how he'd soon be a success. Then my mother lowered her voice, but not enough. "And she's just playing at college. Mark my words, she'll end up back here doing what she does best, cleaning." The neighbors chuckled politely. Something in me snapped. I excused myself, went upstairs to the bathroom, and stared at my reflection in the mirror. My hands smelled of charcoal and meat from grilling my hair stuck to my forehead with sweat. I thought of the sponge always waiting for me in the kitchen sink, its corners frayed, its smell sour. I imagined throwing it away, never touching it again. That night before I left, I actually did it. I dropped the sponge into the trash can, closed the lid, and walked out without looking back. It was a tiny act, almost meaningless, but it felt like setting fire to a chain that had bound me for too long. From then on, I limited my trips home. The phone calls from my parents turned sharp, filled with accusations of being ungrateful. "After all we've done for you," my father said, as though feeding and housing me had been a favor instead of their responsibility. My mother called me selfish, claiming I thought I was better than them. I didn't argue. I learned silence was sometimes the strongest answer. At school, I poured myself into classes and work. I stayed late in the computer lab eating crackers for dinner, my eyes burning under fluorescent lights. I volunteered for research projects, asked endless questions, pushed myself to exhaustion. Some nights, I fell asleep at my desk, my face pressed to notes smudged with ink. But with every test I aced, with every project I completed, I felt myself rising inch by inch out of the shadow they had buried me in. When graduation came, I stood in line wearing a borrowed gown, the tassel swinging nervously as I clutched my diploma case. My parents didn't bother to attend. They claimed they were busy, though I knew they simply didn't care. I walked across that stage anyway, my heart hammering, the sound of applause for strangers ringing in my ears. I smiled for the camera holding my diploma up high, even though no one I loved was there to see it. The first job I landed was at a corporation so large it intimidated me. The building rose like glass and steel ambition, and I walked inside, clutching a tote bag that had a broken zipper. I started at the bottom entry level, answering phones, fetching copies. My parents laughed when they heard. "See, we told you. You're just a glorified secretary." But I didn't care. I had my foot in the door, and I wasn't letting go. I worked harder than anyone else. I volunteered for assignments no one wanted, stayed late to learn systems, studied reports until numbers swam in my head. I watched the women in suits stride across the lobby and imagined myself among them. Slowly, my effort was noticed. A manager praised my problem solving. A director invited me to sit in on meetings. I rose one promotion at a time, never forgetting the nights I went hungry or the weekends I scrubbed floors while my brother lounged. My parents didn't change. They still called me to clean when holidays came, still dismissed my achievements as luck. My brother still smirked, as though certain the world owed him everything. But inside, I was changing. I no longer felt invisible. Each paycheck, each new title, each problem solved was a layer of armor. I was becoming someone they couldn't define, someone they couldn't control. One evening, walking home under the city lights, I realized I hadn't thought about the old sponge in months. Instead, I thought about the chipped mug I carried from college, still sitting on my desk at work. It reminded me of where I had started, but also of how far I had come. And though the road ahead was long, I finally believed I was walking towards something that belonged only to me. The office became my second home, and in many ways, my salvation. I was the first one in most mornings, the hum of fluorescent lights greeting me before the coffee machines even sputtered awake. I stayed long after others left, combing through spreadsheets, drafting proposals, and absorbing every detail I could. My parents dismissed it whenever I mentioned work, mocking me for being nothing more than a corporate servant. Yet within those walls, I was slowly building a reputation. Colleagues began to notice that when a project was in trouble, I was the one who stayed calm, the one who found a solution when others were ready to quit. I became the quiet problem solver, the one who took on challenges no one else wanted. Each successful delivery earned me another step upward, another layer of respect that contrasted so sharply with the disregard I had known at home. I kept one symbol of my old life close, the chipped mug I had carried from my college days. It sat on my desk, holding pens instead of coffee, a reminder of the nights I stayed up studying while everyone else slept. Each time I looked at it, I felt the fire in me burn hotter, pushing me forward. Promotions came slowly at first, then more quickly. I was no longer answering phones or fetching copies. I was leading small teams, then entire departments. Invitations to high-level meetings appeared in my inbox, and executives began asking for my input. Still, during holidays, my parents called to remind me about family duty, expecting me to come home and scrub their kitchen as though nothing had changed. I went less and less, my silence on the phone their only answer. Inside, though I was resolute, I was climbing, and I wasn't going to stop. Every time they minimized me, I doubled my effort at work. I didn't need their approval anymore, but part of me wanted them to choke on the sight of what I had become. The invitation to the leadership retreat arrived in my inbox on a Tuesday morning, tucked between a flood of ordinary messages, yet it glowed like a key to a locked room I had been circling for years. It was an exclusive event, the kind of gathering where only senior executives and promising leaders were summoned, and it was hosted by none other than the CEO himself, the same man whose framed photograph had hung in my parents' living room like a shrine. For years, they bragged about shaking his hand as though proximity to his success made them special. Now, I was being invited to stand in the same room, not as a fan, not as an admirer, but as one of his own. The retreat was held at a glass-walled resort on the edge of a lake, the kind of place where every detail whispered wealth and power. I arrived early, heels clicking across polished floors, my portfolio under my arm. My reflection in the mirrored elevator startled me. I wasn't the girl with raw hands and secondhand sweaters anymore. I wore a tailored suit, my hair pinned neatly, my expression steady. But the chipped mug from my college days was still tucked in my bag, a small reminder of why I had fought so hard to reach this place. The first session was nerve-wracking. We sat around a massive oak table, the CEO at the head, his presence commanding but warm. He opened the discussion, and soon eyes turned toward me as I presented a strategy I had worked on for weeks. My voice didn't shake. I laid out numbers, patterns, risks, and solutions, and when I finished, the silence that followed was not dismissive, it was thoughtful, charged. The CEO leaned forward, his fingers steepled, and then he smiled. "This," he said, "is exactly the kind of leadership we need. She doesn't just see problems, she sees paths forward." He looked directly at me. "You're the boss here." The words landed like thunder inside me. Applause rose around the table, colleagues nodding, some even taking notes. My chest felt tight, not with fear, but with a fierce, blazing relief. For years, I had been called servant maid, ungrateful daughter. In that moment, the highest authority in the room, the man my parents worshipped, had called me boss. What I didn't know until the break was that my parents had managed to secure guest passes. I spotted them lingering near the refreshments, their posture stiff, their eyes wide. My mother clutched her handbag like it could shield her. my father's mouth hanging open as though he'd swallowed his words. They had seen it. They had heard it. The CEO they adored had stood in front of them and praised me in ways they had never dared. The memory of all the nights scrubbing their floors crashed against the sight of them now powerless, cornered by truth. During the networking reception that followed, the CEO approached me again, this time with a hand on my shoulder. "You have something rare," he said. "Not just intelligence, resilience. People who grow from hardship make the best leaders." His words carved into me, both soothing and stinging. I nodded, thanking him, but inside, I was spiraling. Because he had no idea just how deep that hardship ran, no idea that the very people across the room sipping champagne had once forced me to kneel and scrub, while they boasted about knowing him. I excused myself to the balcony, the night air cool against my skin. Below, the lake shimmered with reflections of lanterns strung across the terrace. I gripped the railing, my heart pounding, my mind replaying the CEO's words over and over. Boss. It was a title, but also a lifeline. I realized that I had finally climbed beyond the cage they had built for me. When I stepped back inside, my parents approached. My mother's voice, usually sharp, trembled. "Honey," she began, as if the word could erase decades of dismissal. My father tried to smile, but it looked foreign on him, a mask he didn't know how to wear. "We're so proud," he said, the lie heavy between us. I stared at them, their faces suddenly small, in the glow of the chandeliers. I thought of every birthday forgotten, every insult muttered, every chore demanded, while my brother basked in comfort. I thought of the sponge I had thrown away, of the certificate I hid under my mattress, of the chipped mug that still waited on my desk. For the first time, I didn't feel anger. I felt distance. They could no longer touch me. I extended my hand, professional, impersonal. They hesitated, then shook it, the gesture clumsy and hollow. Around us, executives mingled glasses, clinked, conversations flowed. To everyone else, we looked like a successful family celebrating. But inside, I knew the truth. Their respect was not real. It was forced, extracted by the undeniable fact that the man they admired now admired me. I turned away before they could say more, heels striking the marble floor, each step steady and final. That night, back in my hotel room, I placed the chipped mug on the bedside table. I poured water into it, sat in the armchair, and stared out at the dark lake. For the first time in my life, I felt the weight of a title that mattered, not because the CEO had given it to me, but because I had finally given it to myself. Boss. Not of them, not of anyone else's approval. Boss of my own life. The girl who had once been their maid had vanished, leaving only the woman who had built herself from the ground up. After the retreat, the air between my parents and me shifted, though not in the way they expected. They tried to close the gap with sudden sweetness, voices laced with awkward warmth, as if they believed a few soft words could erase decades of coldness. My mother called me darling for the first time since I was small, her tone brittle and rehearsed. My father clasped my shoulder, his grip tentative, and muttered that he had always known I'd make something of myself. But their eyes betrayed them, fearful, calculating, desperate to rewrite the story, now that the world had seen the truth. I stood there silent, letting their words fall flat between us. I remembered every insult disguised as a joke, every chore handed down like a punishment, every birthday left unmarked. None of it could be undone by their sudden scramble to claim me now. They wanted proximity to my success, the way they had once wanted proximity to the CEO in that framed photo. They didn't see me. They only saw the reflection of power. That realization didn't sting anymore. It freed me. When they invited themselves to visit my office a week later, I let them. They arrived dressed carefully, my mother in pearls, my father in a suit too stiff for him. Their eyes darted around the sleek glass lobby, clearly dazzled. When my assistant approached and asked if they were family, I watched them straighten proudly, ready to bask in recognition. But I answered first, "They're visitors." Their faces flickered at the word, but I didn't waver. During the brief tour, they marveled at everything, yet they stumbled when they reached my office door, my nameplate gleaming beside it. My father touched the letters as though they might burn him. I invited them in politely, offered them water, and continued with my emails while they sat in silence, the imbalance of power pressing into the room. When they left, I shook their hands again, professional, detached. No hugs, no warmth, only civility. Walking them to the elevator, I felt the final pieces of the past fall away. They could no longer reduce me, and I no longer needed their validation. Respect forced by circumstance wasn't respect at all. As the doors closed on their stunned faces, I heard the echo of my heels on the marble floor, a sound that felt like closure. For the first time, I realized revenge hadn't been necessary. Dignity was louder than anger, and silence could be sharper than any words. My parents admired the CEO, but the CEO admired me. That was all the reckoning they would ever get. In the quiet that followed, I found myself reflecting not on my parents, but on the long road that had brought me here. The girl who once knelt on the kitchen floor, hands raw from bleach, was still inside me, but she no longer carried shame. She carried proof that I had survived being invisible, proof that I had turned neglect into fuel. Healing didn't come all at once. At first, it was jagged, messy. I felt the old anger rising when I saw families at the park, mothers brushing crumbs from their daughters' cheeks with the tenderness I had craved. I felt the ache of birthdays spent alone, the sting of being called Maid in my own home. But slowly, life stitched itself together in quieter ways. I built friendships with people who valued me for who I was not, for what I could do for them. I found joy in small freedoms, choosing fresh flowers for my apartment, cooking dinner, only when I wanted to, leaving dishes in the sink without fear of judgment. At work, I mentored young women who reminded me of myself, determined but overlooked. I told them the lesson I had learned the hardest way, that dignity is not given, it is claimed. I kept the chipped mug on my desk no longer as a symbol of struggle, but as a reminder of growth. It had survived cracks, just as I had, and still, it held what it needed to hold. My parents never changed fully. Their apologies were shallow, their respect conditional. But I no longer needed them to be different. Their voices had lost the power to define me. The real victory wasn't when the CEO called me boss, though. That moment mattered. The real victory was the day I finally believed it myself. For years, I thought my worth depended on their recognition. Now I knew better. My worth had always been mine, waiting for me to claim it. If someone listening to my story has ever been treated like less, I want them to know this: you are not invisible. You do not need to wait for anyone to grant you value. It is already there, in the quiet strength of what you have endured. Share your story if you wish. Carry it like I carried mine. And remember, the greatest shift doesn't come when others finally see you. It comes the moment you see yourself clearly and without doubt. That is when you become free.